So without any ado, I'll move right into an introduction with Nick Hobbs, the Head of Advice and Investigations at the Children and Young People's Commission Office. Nick, thank you so much for joining us here today. Would you mind giving yourself an introduction to our wonderful audience? Tell them a bit about what you do here.
Of course. Morning, Kayla. Thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this event. It's really good to be here this morning. So I'm Nick Hobbs. I'm Head of Advice and Investigations at the Office of the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland. And our job really is very straightforward. It's to promote and safeguard children's human rights, and that's set out in legislation. The office was created by the Scottish Parliament by law, and that law tells us what we have to do. It tells us a little bit about how we should do it. So it tells us, for instance, that we have to involve children and young people in everything that we do. It tells us that the UNCRC, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, is at the heart of all the work that the Commissioner's Office does. And it really kind of sets the framework for how we work. When we talk to kind of younger children and young people about what the office does, sometimes the way that we try to explain it is that when the UK and therefore Scotland sign up to international treaties like the UNCRC, what they're doing is making a series of promises about how children will be treated. And our job is to make sure that the UK and the Scottish governments keep those promises. So that's quite a nice way, I think, of trying to explain it to younger children and possibly also to adults as well.
Oh, definitely, 100%. Often these kind of conversations can get quite complex and quite daunting very, very quickly for adults, never mind children and young people. So that definitely seems to be a lovely way to cover it all around. So I'm sure our audience would like to hear so many things from you today and would have so many questions. However, to kick us off, can you just give us a kind of overview, I suppose, jargon-free perspective on what the UN Convention of the Rights for the Child actually means for health and social care specifically, particularly for some of the more vulnerable children and their parents and carers, such as disabled children, children living with long-term conditions, those kinds of groups?
Jargon-free, that's quite an ask. I will do my best, but please do pick me up on if I drift into jargon or to acronyms. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, whenever we talk about it, we talk about how special it is and how important it is, because it's the only international human rights treaty that relates specifically to children, and it frames children as rights holders, so active agents in their own lives, so not just passive recipients of kind of care and charity. So it's really important that it gives children agency in that regard. And it starts off with, we focus quite a lot on the articles, but actually the preamble of the convention is really important as well. So that's the bit at the start that tells you, that sort of sets the context for the rest of it, that tells you what the convention is all about. And there's a part of the preamble that says every child should grow up in a family environment of happiness, love, and understanding. And I think that's really important to understand what the convention is all about. Happiness, love, and understanding. To have that written into an international treaty, an international human rights treaty, which I think people often view as being very distant and very abstract and very technical. But right from the very start, it's talking about happiness, love, and understanding, and that's really, really important.
This is it.
The convention also, it sets out a range of different rights that all children have. So everyone under the age of 18 is a child in international law. And everyone under the age of 18 has these rights. But there are particular groups within the convention that are given additional rights to recognise that they have particular needs and particular vulnerabilities that are distinct from other groups of children. So the convention makes special provision for children who are care experienced, for children who are disabled, and for children who are refugees, for instance. So there are different groups of children within the convention that get that kind of additional protection. So within the health and social care environment, that will be relevant for I think for all of the people listening. You will be engaging not just with children as a group, but with particular groups of children who have particular needs, and so that understanding of that is really, really critical.
Yeah, 100%. I'm particularly thinking of disabled children and children with long-term conditions. The medical world can be complex and scary for, quite frankly, all of us, never mind at such a young age. And often with children, it can nearly feel like, even looking from the outside, nearly like things are happening to them rather than they're being involved in those decisions. So the Convention for the Rights of the Child, that is all to do with that kind of area as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The convention is about empowering children, and also about empowering people who work with children, to support them. So we can get very technical and start going into individual articles, but I'll maybe pull a couple out, because I think they're it's useful to talk about them individually. So it's important to understand, first of all, I think that all of the rights in the convention are equal. So there's no hierarchy of rights. There's no right that's more important than the others. No one right to rule them all. But what there is are Article 12 and Article 3. So Article 3 is about children's best interests. So that says that in every decision that's made about a child or a group of children by the government, by a health board, by police, by social workers, by teachers, whoever, the child's best interests has to be a primary consideration.
Yeah.
And best interests is understood as all of the other rights in the convention. So best interests is a really important right for people to understand and to try and get their heads around. Article 12 also provides that, again, that when you're making these decisions, children have the right to take part in them, and to take part in them in a way that's meaningful and in a way that's consistent with their age and stage of development. So that, again, that's a really important part of the framing for decision making, about empowering children to take an active role in their own lives. And so those two, I think, in terms of what you've just said, are really important to kind of pull out to start with.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Another group of children that are particularly vulnerable, particularly kind of, I suppose, to get their human rights carried forward and safeguarded, really, is children experiencing poverty, particularly considering that right now we are going through a cost of living crisis. As we all know, the costs keep going up, and unfortunately wages and living conditions aren't quite matching that right now. I know that there are articles that reference if, for example, parents and guardians can't provide for children, don't have sufficient resources to provide for children, that they should be provided for. So how, within particularly a health and social care setting, how does the Convention of the Rights of the Child play into all of that then?
Yeah. So poverty consistently, I mean, I've worked for the office for just over 6 years, and poverty consistently is one of the top sort of 2 or 3 issues that children and young people have raised with us over the whole of that time. And as you say, things are getting worse in terms of the cost of living crisis, the impact of austerity policies at UK government level. It is increasingly, I think, really, really tough for loads of families out there, and increasingly tough for those who are trying to support them. So those in the health and social care workforce. We're also coming out of the back of the COVID pandemic. And while to some extent it's dropped off the news, I think children and families and professionals are still really dealing with the aftermath of that in a way that I'm not sure we've really properly got to grips with. So it is really, really tough out there. And I think there's a risk maybe that people start to think about incorporation of the UNCRC as a luxury, something a luxury that we can't afford at the moment.
Right.
That people start to think, well, actually, maybe we should put this off until we've got a bit more time, a bit more space, a bit more resource, a bit more energy, a bit more money.
Yep.
And I understand, I do understand where that kind of view comes from. But I would say that incorporation right now is even more important than it's ever been, precisely because of the situation that we find ourselves in. Because what incorporation does is it provides a framework for decision making.
Right.
So it allows for those really tough decisions that people are making right now about resources and about capacity. It provides a framework for that to take place within. And most importantly, it's a framework that equalizes the imbalance of power that otherwise exists between children and adults.
Of course.
So we know that children have less political power than adults. They don't get to vote. They have less economic power than adults. And our systems of decision making are very often set up with adult interests in mind. They're not set up very often to engage children and young people. So there's a real imbalance of power there. Incorporation redresses that imbalance. So it gives children the space at the center of decision making that they're entitled to. It makes sure that their interests are given proper and full consideration. It makes sure that that when we're trying to allocate scarce resources, that children and young people get their fair share of that pie.
Yeah.
So incorporation is absolutely critical in terms of where we find ourselves now, just because of the kind of the culture and practice change that it will bring to the way in which we make decisions. It's also, I think, really, really important because there are specific rights within the convention that relates again to rights to health, but also, as you say, the right to benefit from social security is a really important right for children and young people.
Yeah.
And that does relate very, very strongly to poverty. The right to education, because human rights are interconnected and indivisible. So if you're living in poverty, if you're living in inadequate housing, inadequate accommodation, if you're struggling to sleep, if you're really stressed, your other rights are going to suffer. Your right to education, your right to play, your right to kind of health and development.
Yeah.
All of those things are interconnected, and incorporation is absolutely critical to doing what we can to tackle the impact of poverty on children.
That's really striking, actually. Just the fact that you just mentioned the right to play. I found it really, I suppose, heart-wrenching, because you mentioned that children are bringing forward as one of their top issues repeatedly poverty. How on earth that must impact their right to play, just as a really basic thing, because if they're so concerned at such a young age about poverty, what they're going to eat, if they're warm enough, clothes, those kind of basic necessities, that is really going to, I suppose, eat away at that fundamental right to be a child, to play, to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel secure. And of course, that's going to have massive impacts on development, as you've said, that we've already seen, particularly from the pandemic and now this cost of living crisis. That's really, really, I suppose, insightful for you to touch on.
But I'd love to pretend that it was entirely my insight, but
Yeah.
this is from what children and young people have told us. So we've spoken to groups of children and young people and individual children who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, and this is exactly what they say. You're absolutely right. It's poverty is the kind of theft of childhood. Very often that's kind of often how children express it, is that it's such an overwhelming issue, such an overwhelming part of your life, however much your parents may be trying to protect you from it, that it does kind of impact on your life across a whole range of different areas.
Well, this is the thing. I think we're often tempted to believe that children know and understand less than we really give them credit for. We do kind of, I suppose, nearly hope that they don't know these things, hope that we can shelter them from these things, but that's really not the reality, is it? Children are aware of their surroundings. They are aware of what's happening. They do know what's going on in their lives. And realistically, we can't shelter them from it. We have to involve them in that process, because that will actually give that reassurance and start to therefore give those rights back. Another area that I wanted to touch on, and how the Convention of the Rights of the Child, I suppose, works within this area. Other topics that are really, really important for children and young people currently: mental health, climate change, the environment. Those are real top priority areas. And we're seeing so much anxiety, so much, I suppose, of children's lives weighing on this. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on how this convention and how incorporation, again, touching those health and social care settings, how that will affect how children live their lives, how it will affect these key issues for children and young people.
Yeah, mental health, again, has always been right up there in terms of the issues that children raise with us. And we've recently concluded an investigation. So the office has powers to investigate children's rights issues. So we've recently done an investigation which was led by our Young Advisors Group into counselling in schools. And the recommendations with that are now sitting with Scottish Government and with COSLA to see if we can improve the way in which counselling services are delivered. Excuse me. But obviously counselling is only one part of that. It's an important part. It's within schools, and so it's potentially accessible to very significant numbers of children and young people. But it is only one part. I think one of the important things to understand about incorporation is that we're currently in a space at the moment where we're waiting for the government to bring the bill back to Parliament, and we're hoping that that's going to happen very, very soon. It's been quite a while since the Supreme Court judgments where the court said that there were aspects of the bill that needed amended. And one of the really important things to understand, I think, is that although we would all have liked the bill to cover absolutely every piece of legislation, every aspect of children's lives, that's not proved to be legally possible.
Yep.
But the bill will still cover quite significant children's rights issues. So it's important not to get unduly negative, I think, about this. Incorporation is a process now that we're going through. The most important thing to happen is that the bill comes back.
Yep.
We then need the Scottish Government to look at a legislative audit to make sure that they bring into scope all of the legislation that currently isn't. But there is still lots of legislation that is within scope, and mental health is one of those areas that actually some of the mental health legislation will be covered by the UNCRC bill. And so those rights and that enforceability of rights will be there for mental health, and that's really important for children and young people.
Fantastic. So you mentioned about some areas that weren't covered. What are those kind of areas? And I suppose, importantly, how will they be covered? Yeah. Are there other mechanisms for them to be addressed outside of this?
Yeah. So we've not seen the detail of the Scottish Government's amendments yet. So we probably need to wait for that before making kind of too confident pronouncements. But we do know that there are going to be bits of legislation that aren't covered within this bill. But that doesn't mean that we can't bring them into scope. Yeah. And that's really important. So the Scottish Government, we and others, including Together, have called on the government to do a legislative audit. And so in the services of trying to avoid jargon, what that means is that you go through the different laws within Scotland and you're clear about what's covered already, what isn't covered, and then what's the process for bringing that into the scope of the UNCRC bill. Government needs to kick that off ASAP.
Yep.
Because we then need to get into that process of bringing all of that legislation within the scope of the bill. But people don't need to wait for that. I think that's the other really important aspect. Scotland is not the first country to incorporate the UNCRC, and one of the lessons that we draw from Norway, from Sweden, from countries that have done it already, is that it's not just about the law. It's not just about the ability to go to court to enforce your rights. It's actually about culture change.
Yeah.
So that's something that is already progressing in Scotland in kind of many ways. It's something that can continue to happen, regardless of how long it takes us to bring all those pieces of legislation into the scope of the bill. Organisations and individuals who are working with children and young people can still act as if the bill is enforced, because these are existing duties in international law. These aren't new duties on public bodies. What the bill will do is bring them into domestic law, is make them justiciable, so children go to court to access their rights. But these are duties that have been in place for 30 years. Yeah. So we need to push ahead with that culture change. We need people to change. We need people to be thinking about bringing children into the spaces where decisions are made, about challenging policy, challenging practice within their own organisations. And we need organisations to make the space for people to do that. We need organisations to make the space for people to be children's rights champions. And maybe that's a nice message to kind of enter.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Nick. It's been wonderful hearing from you. I'm sure that's given our audience a lot to take away. I know for sure it's given me a lot to take away. So thank you so much for your time. We're going to move now into some creative input. So stay with us. There's a wonderful video here from Children in Scotland before we move on to our panel discussion at 10:30. The Children Views service is part of a national partnership of My Rights, My Say. We wanted to make an animation that primarily showed children and young people how our service operates and what they can expect from us. The animation was co-created with children and young people who directed the content, the wording, characterization, and the visual style. The collaborative process was steeped in the UNCRC Article 12, as this is a service that they provide. As always, feel that the end product has far greater clarity in its messaging than can ever typically be achieved, because children and young people were incorporated in it so that everyone would understand it. We often go to great lengths to overcomplicate explanations for services, but we feel that this animation is a testament to the power of listening. to the voices of children and young people and using our platform as adults to amplify them. So please sit back and enjoy.
Picture this. You've got a big meeting coming up about where you go to school and to plan what support you need. Or you need to talk to professionals because someone treated you differently because of your disability. There are all these adults, coming and going, talking around you, but none of them are really understanding what you have to say. But hold on, as the main character in your life, you have the right to be heard. My Rights, My Say has a service called Children's Views, and they can help. Meet Marie. She's not like everyone else. She works for Children's Views. If you're between 12 and 15 in Scotland and you have an additional support need, Children's Views can make sure your voice is heard when people are making decisions that affect you. She's independent, meaning she doesn't work for your school, or your parents, or the council. All she cares about is you and your right to be heard. She'll meet you and listen to what you have to say. She won't interrupt and she won't push you for an answer. She also won't tell you what to do or what not to do. Meeting Marie is a chance to slow everything down. You can meet with Marie or talk online or on the phone as many times as you need to figure out what you want to say. She'll write down exactly what you say and will turn it into a report. Before she sends it to anyone else, you get to read over what she's written, and if anything isn't quite right or you've changed your mind, then you can let her know. Once you've said OK to Marie's report, she'll pass on what you've said to the professionals that are making the decisions. And she'll make sure they listen to your views. If you could use someone like Marie, ask your parent or carer to go to My Rights, My Say. Remember, you're the main character. It's your right to be heard.
I hope you enjoyed that video from Children in Scotland as much as I did. However, now it's time to move on to our panel presentations. Today, I'm really grateful to be joined by Sarah, Rona, Ellie, and Mark. So I'm going to start with Sarah McDermott. Sarah is the development manager at Together, working with Together's memberships to support the implementation of the UNCRC. Sarah is passionate about children's rights and has previously worked for the Children and Young People's Commissioners Scotland, working on incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law. She was also the policy principal at the Children's Commissioner for Jersey, where she provided children's rights advice to the government on changes to law and policy during the pandemic, and led on the production of the Commissioner's report to the UN Committee of the Rights of the Child. Sarah has also worked in the third sector for several years at Children in Scotland, where she worked on a range of projects, and was previously at the Health and Social Care Alliance, where she focused on carers' rights. Sarah has a master's in human rights law, as well as an LLB law with French language, and is a former member of the Children's Panel. Thank you for joining us today, Sarah. I'll pass you on for your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll just start screen sharing, but while I'm doing so, oh, apologies, I think I need to be given permission to share my screen, so just give that moment. But just to say as well, thanks so much for the conversations earlier too. It was great to kind of listen in and hear some of your discussions, so thanks very much for that. And hopefully slides coming up for everybody. Can I get a wee thumbs up? Yeah, perfect, seeing some nods, perfect, thank you very much. Yeah. Brilliant. So yeah, thank you again for having me here today. It's great to be here and speaking about children's rights, my favourite topic in the whole world. So if you're not aware of Together's, we are the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights. So we are an alliance of over 500 members. So that's made up of NGO organisations. So you're kind of big organisations like Together through to smaller community-based organisations. We also have individual members, so people who are passionate and committed to children's rights. And if you'd like to find out more about membership, there's a little link in the slides which will follow. And our vision is for all children and young people growing up in Scotland to have their human rights respected, protected and fulfilled. And so we work to inspire and enable everyone in Scotland to put children and young people's human rights at the heart of everything they do. So that's us in a nutshell. Obviously, we're here today talking a lot about incorporation and children's rights in different kinds of formats too, and we'll be hearing some fantastic kind of practice examples too later on. But I thought I'd maybe take a couple of minutes just to speak a wee bit about some of the international work that's been going on too. And starting with the fabulous Team Scotland UN. So just for context, every sort of 5 to 6 years, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, so they're sort of the custodians of the UNCRC, if you like. And every 5 to 6 years, they ask countries to report on what they're doing around children's rights, and they can give kind of advice and recommendations on what to do for the next 5 or 6 years as well. So it was a really exciting time. Just recently, we had Team Scotland UN going to speak to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And they were highlighting a lot of different issues that were facing children and young people in Scotland and throughout the UK. So we had members of the Children's Parliament and members of the Scottish Youth Parliament speaking to the committee, as well as ourselves and the Commissioner's Office as well, that you've heard from already, obviously from Nick. So to inform that, we had our report here on the left-hand side. So this was our State of Children's Rights report. So that was based on lots of different research, speaking to children and young people, speaking to our member organisations in that big network that we've got, and a bit further afield to hear what's really going on for children and young people in Scotland. The Commissioner's Office, not just the Scottish Office, but with the rest of the UK Commissioners, also submitted this report in the middle. And really importantly as well, children and young people in Scotland also submitted this report on the right-hand side. So that was led by the members of the Children's Parliament and members of the Scottish Youth Parliament as well there. And that highlights kind of 6 key areas, many of which you've touched on already actually in discussions around climate and equality, for example. And what this has led to is these recommendations. So they get called concluding observations, but in essence, it's kind of Scotland's to-do list. It's what do we need to do as a country to kind of work towards them. So there's around about 200, so there's quite a bit to do. But we do have 5 or 6 years until the next one, so there is time. But I just thought I'd pick out just a couple of quotes for them to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that have been coming up. So one is to a recommendation from the committee to ensure that the rights of children with disabilities are heard in decisions that affect them. They've also called for incorporation to happen really quickly, so to expeditiously bring forward amendments necessary to progress with incorporation. To establish clear avenues for children to seek justice, and talking about kind of bigger kind of policy pieces, I suppose, as well around, you know, developing strategies to address health inequalities, for example. And these are, I thought I'd kind of refer back to the last time around to show what kind of impact I suppose they can have. So these were some of the recommendations from the last time around. So we had about 150 or so last time around. And the ones in green at the top are areas where we've seen real progress. So, for example, the third one on the list around equal protection. So that was to prohibit the use of all physical punishment. And we saw that through the Equal Protection from Assault Act now that was passed a few years ago. There's areas in the middle here in this kind of yellowy orange colour where we've seen some progress. So, for example, around the age of criminal responsibility. So this is a law that means that children can't be held criminally responsible. Is kind of the phrase really, I suppose. But they can't be held criminally responsible from the age of 12 currently in Scotland. But internationally, the UN committee, so these kind of custodians of the UNCRC, have said the minimum age really should be 14, and that's the minimum. And you can look to raise it beyond that too. So we've seen some progress, but we still need to see some more. And then the last one I'll mention in the red was around kind of mosquito devices. So they've been called that because they emit a really kind of high-pitched noise that's pretty constant and sounds absolutely horrible to be around, to put it mildly. Now, ears like mine, I'm a bit older, so I can't hear them, but these sounds are predominantly heard by young people and by children. So that's something we've not seen progress on. It's something that's kind of come back up as well. But I think, though, this to me just kind of shows that these concluding observations or these recommendations or this to-do list, it really gives us in this sector a space to keep pushing for progress. and that if we look to concluding observations that have happened and these recommendations, that can help to kind of harness our work. So to support our calls around equality, around progressing children's rights, right through to incorporation. So we've got that kind of backing from the international community there as well. I know we're kind of going to go into wider discussions, so I'll just finish on a slide here. I can send them around, but just a set of kind of resources that are always kind of helpful to draw on. But I'll stop there for now and look forward to speaking to you all later on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was absolutely wonderful to actually hear Scotland's to-do list. I actually can't believe, but also 100% can believe that there's over 200 points on that to-do list. I'm sure that many of us here will have felt like we've had to-do lists that long, but that is amazing that so many points have been made for children in Scotland, and that there is actually, it's all lined up as work to be done. Moving on then to Rona Matherson. Rona is a Chief Executive of Starcatchers, Scotland's arts and early years organisation, having joined as the project manager of the pilot project in 2006. She's a passionate advocate for the role that the arts have to play in the lives of our youngest children, and championing their access to high quality arts and creative experiences that they can share with their parents and carers. She's currently undertaking a Master's in Science in Children's Rights at Queen's University Belfast, with a specific focus on the visibility or invisibility of babies with children's rights. Rona is the co-chair of the Federation of Scottish Theatre and of Playground, a specialist early years arts initiative in Kent. Thank you for joining us, Rona. I'll hand it over to you to take us away.
Thanks very much. That was a full introduction there. Beautifully done. Thank you. It's really nice to be here this morning. I haven't got slides because I have to say my brain is completely consumed at the moment by the dissertation for my master's on children's rights, and I'll talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing with that shortly. But I've got some links that I'll post in the chat just to allow people to kind of follow up on some of the things that I'm talking about. So to start with, just a little overview of Starcatchers and what we do. So as Kayla said, Starcatchers is Scotland's arts and early years organisation, and we specialise in arts and creative experiences for babies, toddlers, young children from birth to 5 years and their parents and carers. And we do that through a kind of a multi-stranded programme of work. So we produce and tour theatre productions that we take to art centres and community spaces across Scotland. And through that, we enable lots of babies and young children to access their right to arts and culture, that are part of Article 31 of the Convention. But what we also do is we deliver programmes of community engagement in areas of deprivation, essentially. So we run programmes for babies and their carers in Wester Hailes in Edinburgh, in parts of Fife and in Moray at the moment. And the focus of that work is really looking at that consistent contact between artists and the wee ones and their parents and carers, and looking at how the arts can be a vehicle in that space, not just in terms of providing lovely, beautiful opportunities to play together, babies and their parents playing together, but also thinking about how that supports their social and emotional development, how it impacts on mental health and well-being, not just for the babies, but also for the parents. And we're quite often working with young parents. So it has that sort of multi-stranded impact. And what we've sort of discovered, or I suppose the understanding that we've developed over the last 17 years in terms of developing a rights-based approach to our work, is that the work that we're doing isn't just about that Article 31 and the importance of enabling children to access arts and cultural life, but it's also about how these kinds of experiences support children's optimal development. So that part of Article 6, that aspect of the right to be heard. So all of our work is about listening to babies and young children and understanding what they are telling us, how they are using their bodies, how they're using their different languages to share their views, and how that informs the work that we then do with them, how it encourages their self-expression, how it supports their early education and learning, and that sort of positive health and well-being. So there's a whole range of rights that come through the work that we're doing. So as I said, there are a couple of other things that we do. We do programs of training for the early learning and childcare workforce, because we want that workforce to be really confident in using their innate creativity when they're working with babies and young children every day. And we also really champion, we use advocacy to champion the role of arts and culture in early years. So kind of going back to that point around listening to the voices of babies, I have a bit of an issue about the fact that we talk about voice all the time in terms of children's participation, and actually for babies and young children, but also for other children who are non-verbal, this idea that we only focus on voice becomes a real barrier to them being able to access their rights. So Starcatchers has developed a few things over the years that really helps us to understand what babies are telling us. So way back in the kind of the early days, we developed some engagement signals we were working with some academic researchers from the University of Exeter and then the University of Strathclyde, and they developed these engagement signals, which I'll just post a link to a page in the chat where people can find them. So that's a suite of 7 different observational signals that we use and we have used for the last kind of 15 years to really understand what the babies are sharing with us in the sessions that we develop. But also we share that. We've shared it with early years practitioners, with other artists, with other people to help them understand what babies might be saying. And with the developments that have been happening around Incorporation over the last few years, we observed that people were asking us about how you do consultation with babies. And we were sort of sitting as a team in the office kind of going, oh, that's really interesting, because we don't have a particular, we have our engagement signals and we use other tools, but we hadn't really thought about it as sort of developing a kind of consultation approach. But we, with some support from CatNac and from some other funders, we've been developing a research project that is looking at an arts-based methodology for participation with pre and non-verbal children. It really trips off the tongue, but there are the first phase of that work has been completed, and the second phase is underway at the moment. And that will allow us to create a toolkit using the arts as that vehicle to enable babies and young children to express themselves, and how we have that relationship. The first phase of the research identified that relationship between artist, baby and parent or primary carer, and what happens in that space. And you could replace artist with any other kind of professional. So the idea being that we will have a kind of resources and tools that other practitioners can use once that research has finished. I'm kind of conscious of time, so I better wind up. But just to touch on the research that I've been doing around my master's dissertation is on the invisibility of babies within policy and practice. And that's not just looking at what's happening within the arts. It's actually, I've taken all of, so those reporting documents, the processes that Sarah touched on a moment ago, I've looked at the reporting documents of 12 different countries and looked at where babies and young children are referenced. And they're really invisible, particularly in terms of health and birth registration and things like that. But it kind of broadly, they're really invisible. We don't talk about babies, and we don't talk about them often in policy and practice. and we don't talk about them in meetings. So we're in this space and we talk about children and young people, but we don't talk about babies. And my feeling is that if we're going to get incorporation and implementation of the UNCRC really right, we need to start with babies and young children and really understand how we can realise their rights. Because at the moment, their rights there's a limit to how their rights are being realised. And that's the kind of the conclusions that I'm coming to from the work that I've been doing. And I get a bit like a dog. I'm a bit like a dog with a bone. And once I get hooked into these things, and I think more and more that's the kind of piece that I'm going to be shouting about, is that actually we need to talk about babies, and we need to talk about their needs and how we fulfil their rights. So that's what I'm looking forward to moving forward. Thanks very much.
Rona, thank you so much for those wonderful insights. I really, really loved how you touched on that, particularly with babies. It would be easy to focus on making sure that those kind of core human rights are met. For example, being safe, being fed, being warm, all of those basic necessities to live. But I loved that you focused on not just surviving, particularly for babies and young children, but actually supporting them so that they have the opportunity to really thrive, because we know how important those early years are for that type of development. So thank you so much for those insights. Give me a lot to take away from that. Moving on now, I'm going to introduce Ellie Craig. Ellie, her pronouns are she, her, was elected as an MSYP for Glasgow Cathcart in 2019. In March 2023, Ellie was elected as Vice Chair of SYP, but she previously served as a trustee with the project's portfolio and the Deputy Convener of the Education and Lifelong Learning Committee. Since March 2022, Ellie has been taking a lead on The Right Way, a project funded by the Children's Rights Unit, aiming to create a participation framework to showcase to government officials the best way to meaningfully engage young people within their work. Thank you for joining us, Ellie. I will pass over to you.
Hi, just wait for David to share his screen. Okay, thanks so much for inviting me along to chat to you about the work that I've been doing and we've been doing at the Scottish Youth Parliament on the Right Way project. So I'm Ellie, SYP's Vice Chair and MSYP for Glasgow Cathcart. So next slide, please, David. Sorry. So SYP is the democratic voice of Scotland's young people. Our vision for Scotland is of a nation that actively listens to and values the meaningful participation of its young people. Our goal is to make this vision a reality in order to ensure young people in Scotland grow up loved, safe and respected and able to realise their full potential. We provide a national platform for young people to discuss the issues that are important to them and campaign for the changes to the nation that they live in. We are also entirely youth-led. I'm one of 8 young people who make up SYP's Board of Trustees. Next slide, please, David. First, we want to set the scene and context for the work that I'm doing and how it links to the UNCRC implementation. A lot of this will not be news to people in this room. I think it's important to map the rights journey Scotland is on, and we hope that this project plays a part in its journey. So why participation? Well, SYP have spent a long time arguing for the meaningful participation of young people in decision making, and this is a continuation of that work. While I'm sure people in this room already know a lot about this, it's worth reminding ourselves why meaningful participation is essential, and that's because it's a right, not a gift or a favour for young people, but a right under the UNCRC. Article 12 assures to children and young people the right to express their views freely in all matters affecting them, and for those views to be given due weight. The way to ensure this right is fully realised is to meaningfully include children and young people in decision-making from the earliest point possible in the process and throughout. And it also works. Meaningfully including children and young people in decision-making leads to more inclusive and effective policies that better serve the needs of young people. The quote from an MSYP in our project who said, "Nothing about us without us," really sums up the question of why participation, because the only way decision-makers will know what young people need is through meaningful participation. And why now? While there's been challenges, the expected incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law has put children and young people's rights at the centre of our national debate and provides a brilliant opportunity for us to tackle some of the problems that persist in young people's participation in decision making. While there are some brilliant examples of meaningful youth participation in Scotland, and we'll talk a bit about capturing those later, too often young people have told us that too much engagement is either tokenistic or non-existent. And while we're starting relatively small with this project, our aim is to contribute to a wider culture change and education of decision makers about what makes participation meaningful. The right way to do this might be different for different policy areas, organisations or groups, but the only way to know if it's meaningful is to engage with young people themselves. There's also the context of Scotland today to consider. The pandemic hit young people's rights directly, and it's important to know now that those rights are protected. Next slide, please. The Right Way project. So now onto the project itself and hopefully how it can help people consider the right way for them to engage with young people. The Right Way is a year-long project run by SYP with funding from Children's Rights Unit at the Scottish Government, which came to an end in March of this year. The aim was to support and challenge government and public sector officials to practice the meaningful participation of young people through the development of a participation framework and opportunities to engage with MSYPs. Specifically, we've considered meaningful participation to fundamentally be based on Article 12 of the UNCRC. To begin, we recruited a group of 12 MSYPs to form the project group, which I've led. They have taken key decisions throughout the project, including what policy areas we work with, designing the research, designing the training, and so on. As a youth-led organisation, all of SYP's work involves young people taking key decisions, but with this project, because its focus being on participation, we felt it was particularly crucial that MSYPs took those key decisions and felt meaningfully involved throughout. The Right Way Hub. So a key outcome of the project we wanted to highlight today is our new hub. This is a website with, we hope, all of the information that decision makers, practitioners and officials need to know about meaningfully engaging young people in their work. We are now challenging decision makers to use the hub to ensure that they are upholding young people's Article 12 right to be heard. So the hub includes 7 different resources developed by young people to support decision makers to practice meaningful participation, and I'll touch on one of them shortly. It also has case studies from SYP and other organisations that are experts in youth participation to give inspiration for the different ways we can make participation meaningful. It has frequently asked questions which cover all the different questions that decision makers have asked us throughout the project. And finally, it has a short section highlighting the experiences of some of the young people and Scottish Government officials who took part. Next slide, please. So Aim the Right Way. So this is just one resource as an example for you all. Aim the Right Way checklist for decision makers to use when planning for participation. They help to ensure that participation is accessible, inclusive and meaningful, and it has steps that decision makers can take to make sure that this happens. So next slide, please. Next steps. So we're unashamedly ambitious for this resource, but we know it's only effective if it is robust and it's used. So that was a big reason for developing it in the way we have, to make it as user-friendly as possible. We also know we have a group of MSYPs with an expertise now in Article 12 and participation, our rights champions, and we want to continue to give them opportunities to use that expertise to defend young people's rights. Finally, it's about considering how we continue to challenge when we see bad practice and to call that out and support young people to speak out when their Article 12 right is not being upheld. But it's also about providing support where we can as experts in young people's rights to duty bearers who need to practice meaningful participation in their work. Thanks so much for listening to me today, and of course I'm sure we'll get on to questions later.
Ellie, thank you so much for your full presentation there. That was fantastic. 100% we are going to come back to questions for a full Q&A and discussion session after the break. So I've seen lots of contributions coming up in the chat, so 100% we will cycle back around to those. Sensing a real through line right now between your presentation, Ellie, as well as what's been said by Rona and Sarah about nothing about us without us. And that's certainly the feeling that I'm getting from all these presentations, right from babies, children, young people, and actually crossing, I suppose, that language barrier to children without voices, whether that is because they haven't yet developed their language, for example, with babies, or even children which are non-verbal. So really loving this through line. I'm now going to pass this on to our final panel presentation, and that is Mark Ballard. Mark is the head of policy and influencing for Scotland at the National Deaf Children's Society. He's previously worked for a number of children's charities, including Bernardo's, Children's First, and Save the Children. Before that, he was a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Lothian region, and he's passionate about children's rights. He's a former trustee of Together, the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights. So Mark, thank you for joining us and giving us our last panel presentation.
Thank you, and I'm going to continue to send off talking about Article 12 and nothing about us without us. So I'm going to try and make my slideshow work, which is always a bit of a scary thing. So is that working? Right, I will try again.
Not quite yet, Mark, unfortunately. There we go. Something's coming up.
Perfect.
Grant. So I'm really glad to have been invited here to talk about a rights-based approach to supporting deaf children and young people. And I'm going to start with, I hope, a few facts about deaf children in Scotland. So there are over 3,500 deaf children in Scotland. 90% of deaf children in Scotland are born to hearing parents, and their deafness may be mild, moderate, severe, or profound. Around 10% of deaf children in Scotland use BSL or some kind of signing in school, but many more sign at home. And a lot of the conversations have been around intersectionality of rights. And so it's important to recognise that the way the landscape has changed for deaf children puts across a conversation about children's rights, putting them in context. Newborn hearing screenings mean that we're now much more able to identify deafness when children are very young, in the first few weeks of life. Technology has come on leaps and bounds, which means that there are now amazing options for Bluetooth hearing aids, for cochlear implants, which actually give many more deaf children access to sound than they would have had before. But it's important to recognise that wonderful as the technology is, it doesn't wave a magic wand and give deaf children, the same kind of hearing as their hearing peers. So it gives access to sound, but that using a cochlear implant, using a Bluetooth hearing aid for long periods of time can be absolutely exhausting. So the technology has come on leaps and bounds, but it doesn't magically give similar hearing to other children. There's been a long struggle for deaf people's rights. Scotland has got a really positive role in much of this. Thomas Braidwood's Academy for the Deaf in Edinburgh was the first school for the deaf in the world, and really spread and supported the use of deaf sign language. In 1880, there was a real pushback on the expansion and formalisation of deaf sign language at the Milan Congress on Education for the Deaf, which declared that sign language was inherently inferior to oralism, that spoken language, and ought to be banned, which led to the widespread suppression of sign language in deaf schools throughout the world. But deaf communities continued to use sign language, continued to develop their language and their culture, and there's been a long pushback for many years, which in Scotland we had great work being done at Murray House with Mary Brennan actually proposing the name of British Sign Language back in 1975 to be used for the way that deaf people in Britain communicated. Political struggle, marches, demonstrations in Scotland, that culminated in the BSL Scotland Bill, which was agreed by the Scottish Parliament in 2015. Across the UK, it culminated in the UK BSL Act, which are all important milestones, but I think BSL users would say we're still not there yet. These are milestones, but there's a continuing struggle for deaf people's rights and understanding and recognition of sign language. At the National Deaf Children's Society, our key rights-based approach is called informed choice, and that recognises some parents and some children will choose to use oral approaches, will choose with the aid of technology to use spoken language. Other parents, other children will choose a sign language route. Still other parents and children will choose what's called a total communication approach with both sign language and spoken language. But the important thing, as we've heard earlier, is that the Article 12 right, that this should be the decision of the child within their family. And that means informed choice has an information element, that the information should be there in a value judgment-free way so parents and children can make that choice. But there also has to be a choice. There have to be the facilities and the support to enable that to be a meaningful choice between an oral approach and a sign language approach, or a total communication post. So that very strongly links to Article 12 and Article 23 in terms of the support given to disabled children. And excitingly, we're going to be carrying out at NDCS the first piece of research into how families in Scotland experience that informed choice and whether children's rights to make informed choices are actually being upheld. And hopefully we'll be able to report back in about a year's time on the conclusions of that report research. Deaf awareness is also another key right, which links very strongly to Article 24, children's rights to high quality healthcare. And this means an awareness of BSL and the ability for deaf children and young people to access GPs and other resources using BSL without having to rely on a family member to come in and translate for them, which absolutely infringes on their privacy. But deaf awareness is more than that for children, deaf children who are using cochlear implants or using hearing aids. It means clinicians, those in healthcare, understanding how to communicate effectively with somebody who uses a hearing aid, somebody who's lip reading, about being not hiding your mouse behind your hand, speaking directly to the patient. So there's a lot of deaf awareness, and that's absolutely crucial so that deaf children and young people know they can access resources without having to do all the hard work to make it accessible themselves. Resources should be there for them to use. But finally, it's a key right, which I think marks deaf children out as being in a slightly different position to many other groups, is about Article 30 and language rights, recognising that deaf children who use BSL are a linguistic and cultural minority, and therefore their rights to their language need to be upheld as part of Article 30. And for deaf children and young people who use BSL as their primary or sole means of communication, that puts them in quite a different position from other children who may have an ethnic minority language, but also be learning English. For BSL using young people, BSL is their language, it's their only language, and that needs to be recognised by the services that are there to support them as part of Article 30. And my final point on intersectionality is to link to and highlight the World Federation for the Deaf Declaration on the Rights of Deaf Children, which was agreed only last month. And there's a lot of these rights linked very closely to UNCRC rights and build on UNCRC rights. But understanding that all deaf children have the right to protection from language deprivation, and not providing access to the National Sign Language for all deaf children constitutes discrimination, I think is a really powerful statement. Going back to that notion of deaf children and young people as a linguistic and cultural minority whose rights need to be respected, whatever choices they make about language. I do work for a UK charity though, and it is worth highlighting that this can be challenging. I'm absolutely passionate about the UNCRC. A lot of my colleagues who work for the National Deaf Children's Society in other parts of the UK aren't familiar with it. Incorporation isn't a live issue for them. Therefore, I think everything that the National Deaf Children's Society does is implicitly rights-based, but often we don't pull that out and make it explicit that this is the fundamental basis of what we do. So informed choice is something we talk about across the UK, but in Scotland, we're really trying to highlight that is grounded in Article 12. And also we have the opportunity when the bill is incorporated of a redress mechanism, and I think there's a huge opportunity for us to leverage that redress mechanism to model how you can deliver deaf-friendly, deaf-aware services to the benefit of deaf children right around the UK. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about specifically deaf children and young people, and I hope that gives a particular perspective within the wider conversation of nothing about us without us. Thank you very much.
Mark, 100%. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. I think that was a wonderful bridge into, I think, what everyone was covering, between, yes, how important it is to respect the different cultures surrounding babies, children, and young people, and incorporate them and really protect that, because it is a different culture for being a child. It is, babies have different cultures, never mind then incorporating the different nationalities and the cultures and things that will come with them. And of course, the culture that comes along with, for example, being disabled and being deaf as well. So thank you so much for highlighting that. And I do feel like that it ties us all together very, very well. So thank you for those contributions. And again, I definitely learned a lot and a lot to take away, thinking about my own practices. So thank you again to all of our panelists for all of your fantastic insights and contributions.